Good morning, everybody. I hope that you're doing well. Hey, today's Friday. We made it through 1 week. I know some of you have had questions about some of the assignments. Understand that when you have a multiple choice document from me, Google looks for an answer, and sometimes their answers are not the same as what are indicated in your book, and it will tell you that it's wrong or that there are no correct answers. Use your book, submit the document. I grade them individually. So I look at your answers to make sure that you have the correct answer. So that will not be an issue. Let me remind you that you have your state report on Oregon due tonight. So please make sure that you get that in. Remember, you're emailing those to me the same way that we've been doing it all year long. So please get those in, and I will appreciate that very much. If you're just having technical difficulties with something, I might be able to answer your question for you, but I may have to. It may take some time for me to find an answer. So just do your best. Okay, if I see that you tried something and it didn't work, then I will be more than glad to maybe extend a day or something. But pretty much the instructions are self-explanatory. This is work. Okay, so you are going to have to put forth some effort, even if you're still in your pajamas. And look at me. I got dressed up for you today, and I'm sitting in my classroom. Well, we've been talking about the Constitution. Remember, we've been under the Articles of Confederation for a while, and there were weaknesses. So 55 delegates met in Philadelphia to try to revise the Articles of Confederation. Edmund Randolph came to the conclusion that that wasn't going to be possible, so he proposed drafting a new document, a constitution. And so they set about doing that. They elected 81-year-old Benjamin Franklin as their president, and proceedings started. They got a document drafted. There were 3 men that wrote the Federalist Papers and talked about the negatives and refuted them. And people were divided into Federalists and Anti-Federalists, those that favored the new Constitution, those that did not like the Constitution. We know that in order for the Constitution to pass, it had to have 9 out of 13 states to ratify. There were some that wouldn't ratify because there was no Bill of Rights. They wanted to make sure that citizens were taken care of, that the states nor the federal government could take their rights away. After all, everybody deserves their rights. But some rights are rights that nobody deserves. We just think that because we are who we are, that we deserve something, and that's not always the case. And so they set about drafting the Bill of Rights. And they got that 9th state to ratify, and finally all 13 states came on board by 1781, and we have a constitution. The Constitution itself is divided into several articles. The first 3 articles deal with the branches of government: legislative, executive, and judicial. The legislative branch makes the laws. The judicial branch enforces the laws or interprets the laws, and the executive branch, the president, enforces the laws. And the Constitution lists powers of each of the branches. It gives qualifications for being part of Congress. We'll talk about those next week. And then it gives the Bill of Rights. The Bill of Rights technically is the first 10 amendments to the Constitution. In order to change the Constitution, there has to be an amendment. Now, early on, it was easy to pass amendments. But as the country grew larger, then it became more difficult. And so overall, we have 27 amendments to the Constitution. And we'll talk about all of those today. But the first 10 are probably the most important because they deal with basic rights that we have as American citizens, and even as it has been put by one of our founding fathers, that they are certain unalienable rights. And so the Constitution is there to protect them. As we go through these amendments, you need to understand that some of them are kind of antiquated, like, hey, we're not quartering soldiers anymore. And yet, so that was one of the amendments. So let's begin with Amendment number 1. Amendment number 1 is your Freedoms Amendment, because it gives 4 freedoms in Amendment number 1. Those 4 freedoms are the freedom of religion. You have the freedom to worship according to the dictates of your heart, people say. But that's not really the case. The amendment really was protection against the government making any one religion a necessary or an institutional religion. And so that prevented Maryland from being a Catholic state, or it prevented Pennsylvania from showing favoritism to the Quakers. All right, so we have the freedom of religion. Then we have the freedom of worship. And let me say this, especially in this time right now, just because we don't meet congregate together on Sundays or Wednesdays to worship is not a place. Worship is an attitude. And I'm here to tell you that if we define worship as being in a place, then eventually the government is going to take away our freedom to worship. And so the Supreme Court can legislate a little bit over worship if they deem that something is dangerous, violates common standards of decency, or violates a law. Then the Supreme Court, which is the supreme law of the land, can shut something down. And we as believers, as we're doing now, need to obey the law as long as it does not violate God's word. And we see that in the book of Acts, that men ought to obey God rather than man. But if the law does not violate our religious beliefs as outlined in the Bible, not just what we think, then we have a responsibility to be obedient. That's what we're doing. So I encourage you to watch your church services online. If you don't go to a church, Google one. Watch Union Grove online. On Wednesday nights, the Grove has an online service. And I think you can see that on Instagram. And let me encourage you to do that. And so first of all, we have the freedom of religion. We have the freedom of worship. Then we have the freedom of speech. Now, here's a catchy one. Because the freedom of speech does protect our right to say anything that we want. But it does not protect 2 particular legal terms. One is libel. Libel is false writing about somebody or something. Okay, we have a lot of fake news going around today. That could be a cause for libel. The other is slander. That's false speech, saying things about somebody that is not true. I believe that we hold ourselves to a higher standard as believers to let the words of our mouth and the meditations of our heart be acceptable in God's sight, not acceptable to what man thinks. Because if my words are acceptable in God's sight, then I know that they should be acceptable to man. But then it also protects against things like treason, which is saying or writing anything about the country that would harm the country or advocate its overthrow. And so if people make threats against the president or against certain leaders in our country, then that's cause for treason. And there have been men and women in our history that have been arrested and tried for treason and either were imprisoned or put to death. And so that's treason. Then the 4th freedom under Amendment number 1 is the freedom of the press. Now, again, here's a sticky one, because the freedom of the press is the legal right to publish or publicly spread one's beliefs or opinions. but it does not protect libel, false writings. And so making sure that you have all of your facts straight is going to be very important. And so that's amendment number one, your freedoms amendment. Freedom of religion, freedom of worship, freedom of speech, and freedom of the press. Then we move to amendment number two. And this one is one that probably guys like in particular, because amendment number two is the right to keep and bear arms. And the Second Amendment protects that for us. You might see bumper stickers on the back of cars or redneck pickup trucks that say they can have my gun when they pry my cold dead fingers from around it. But the truth is this: when the amendment was written, every male colonist was expected to have a firearm, because every male colonist was part of the Minutemen, ready to go at a minute's notice. And so the British wanted to take away our guns so that we would not be able to resist the British troops when they would come in. And so amendment number two was protecting those during that time and allowing them to keep their firearms. I'm a amendment two advocate. I'm not necessarily a person who thinks that you should be allowed to have as many as you want and anything that you want, okay? And people that say, well, I've got my AK-47 because that's what I go deer hunting with. You know, that I'm not so sure that is the truth. But anyhow, if you go down to the basement of my house, you'll find some firearms. And I've told you in the past, my dad is a firearms collector. And when and if he dies, and I hope that he doesn't, that probably will be part of my inheritance. But remember, I have 6 brothers and sisters. So all of those firearms will get divided among us. And there are a lot of them. I would estimate probably over 100 firearms that my dad owns. Pistols, rifles, shotguns. And so amendment number 2 is the right to keep and bear arms. Amendment number 3 is the amendment that tells us, getting there, that we don't have to quarter soldiers anymore. Remember, during the time of the Revolution, as British troops came into towns, citizens were forced to house them and to take care of their basic needs. Now we have amendment number 3 in our Constitution. Really doesn't apply to us anymore, but it's there. And it was there to protect the colonists because there still were British troops in the colonies. And we certainly needed that protection. And then amendment number 4. Amendment number 4 begins a series of rights of people when it comes to the legal system. So amendment number 4 is an amendment that protects us against unreasonable searches and seizures. It describes if someone comes to your house legally to search and to seize, in the search warrant, what they're looking for has to be specifically outlined, whether it's things or people. And so that makes it, protects us against that unreasonable search and seizure. During the colonial days, the search warrants were called writs of assistance. And this amendment also protects our right to own and control property. And nobody can violate that for us. Amendment number 5. If you watch a show where there's a court scene and someone pleads the 5th, they are pleading the 5th Amendment. And what they're doing is they're saying, I refuse to testify against myself, or if I testify against myself, it would incriminate me, or it would indicate that I am guilty of something. And so Amendment number 5 protects us in those legal rights. It guarantees that if we get arrested, that we have the right to have an indictment against us. In other words, a listing of what we're being accused of. It protects us against being tried for the same crime twice, which is called double jeopardy. It protects us against testifying against ourselves. And that was one of your questions in Thursday's homework. A person can't be deprived of life, liberty, or property without due process of law. And no kangaroo courts, and no taking you out behind the woodshed and hanging you by a rope anymore. It states that property can't be taken without proper compensation. Because one of the things that the states can do is they can practice what is called eminent domain. If the state needs a piece of your property, or your house is in the way of some type of improvement that would benefit a large group of people, then the state can come to you and they can offer to pay you for that piece of property. And they're supposed to offer you fair market value. If you decline fair market value, then the state can exercise eminent domain. And it's a process, but then they can legally ask you to leave and you'll get nothing. The property becomes theirs. Amendment number 5 also, and it's not in the Constitution, but also brought into being what we call Miranda rights. And hopefully none of you have ever been Mirandized. I've never been Mirandized, but your Miranda rights basically are that you have the right to remain silent. If you give up that right, anything you say can and will be used against you in a court of law. You have the right to an attorney. If you can't afford an attorney, then one will be provided or appointed for you. And before you can be questioned, or as you're being arrested, you should be Mirandized. Okay? And if you don't get Mirandized, then that's a loophole for you to get out of your sticky situation. One of my favorite shows that I used to watch is called In the Heat of the Night. It was about a small town in Mississippi, Sparta, Mississippi, and they had a deputy there. His name was Bubba Skinner, and he was a town hero when it came to football. And his way of Mirandizing was he'd tell the people that he was arresting. He said, "You have the right to be quiet, and I suggest you take it." And that's not the way we can do it today, but it worked in Sparta, Mississippi on the television show. Amendments 4 and 5 deal with, again, our legal system as far as courts are concerned. If you're in the military, you might be subject to a court-martial depending on what you have done. And then the term capital crime has come about. And a capital crime is one that is punishable by death or life in prison. It's a felony. And if you're a felon, there are things that you're not allowed to do. One of them is to vote. You lose that privilege. You may not own or even have in your possession a firearm. Back when President Reagan was alive as president, there was a young man who was infatuated with a television actress, a movie actress, Jodie Foster. His name was John W. Hinckley. And President Reagan was speaking in downtown Washington, D.C., gave a speech, and was leaving the building. And this man, John Hinckley, had written numerous letters to Jodie Foster expressing his undying love for her. And she never responded. Finally, he wrote one letter that said, "I'm going to do something to get your attention." So he found out Reagan was speaking at this hotel. He got in the crowd, and as Reagan was departing the hotel, even with the Secret Service men around him, John W. Hinckley was able to pull the firearm, a pistol, and to shoot President Reagan. Well, Reagan wasn't injured very badly. The Secret Service jumped on top of him. Capitol Hill policemen grabbed John W. Hinckley. But President Reagan's press secretary, James Brady, was shot in the brain and was handicapped from that point on. And so during President Reagan's administration, they passed the Brady Bill. And the Brady Bill, what the Brady Bill does is it gives a waiting period for the purchase of certain firearms. And so you can't just go to a store and buy a gun. You're going to have to fill out paperwork. There's going to be a background check if you do it the legal way. Now, if you just trade guns with somebody or buy it off somebody, none of that happens. But John W. Hinckley, as a result of his attempt on President Reagan, he was put in prison for life. And he got his 15 minutes of fame, as one television actor used to say. Amendment number 6 guarantees us several things. Right to a speedy trial. We have the right to an impartial jury. That means a jury that doesn't have its mind made up. And if you ever get called for jury duty, both attorneys, the attorney for the defense and the attorney for the defendants, are going to try to put certain people on the jury so that it's in their favor. You have the right to be tried in the place where the crime was committed. Sometimes that's not possible because you can't get an impartial jury. You have the right to be confronted or to see the witnesses against you, and you have the right to legal representation. Again, in your Miranda rights, if you can't afford an attorney, then one will be appointed for you by the state. And generally the term for them are legal aid attorneys. Then you have Amendment number 7. And Amendment number 7 really has to do with personal property. And the fact that a person can sue, you can only sue a person, you can't sue a state. And each state has the right to put a limit on how much can be sued for. If you go to one of my shows that we would have watched is People's Court. And in People's Court, there is a limit on how much a person can sue for, as indicated by the state of New York. But each state gets to put its own limit on that, on how much you can sue a person for. And you may not get full compensation for what was stolen or broken or damaged. Amendment number 8 protects us against excessive bail. That bail is the amount of money that is necessary to get you out of jail. It could be through cash or through a bail bondsman. In 1972, the Supreme Court deemed that the death penalty was cruel and unusual punishment. So not a lot of states practice the death penalty anymore. North Carolina is a state that does, but we are on what is called a referendum. They are researching whether or not capital punishment is cruel and unusual. In 1976, they overturned their decision, and in 1977, a nationally recognized case involved someone by the name of Gary Gilmore in the state of Utah. And Gary Gilmore was executed by firing squad in the state of Utah. And that was the first execution after the law had been overturned. They made a movie and a book was written about Gary Gilmore's story. I did my 23andMe. He hasn't shown up yet in my family tree, so I don't know if I'm related to him or not. Oh, there's the bell, but it's not time to go. So then you have Amendment number 9. Amendment number 9 says that if there's a right that's not listed in the Constitution, it doesn't mean that we don't have it. It means that we just have to figure out a way to make it legal as long as it doesn't violate any laws, whether they're moral or civil. And then Amendment number 10, the last of the Bill of Rights. Amendment number 10 guarantees that the central government, that's the national or the federal government, is not going to be able to take away the rights of private citizens or from the states. And so those are your Bill of Rights. And again, they were necessary in order for the Constitution to reach full ratification. And since those first 10 amendments, we've amended the Constitution 17 times. And I'm going to go through these very quickly. Amendment number 10 says that a state cannot be sued by a citizen. Amendment number 12 provides for a separate ballot for president and vice president. There was a time in our history when you voted, when it was a general election, you voted one ballot for a president and one ballot for vice president. So you could have a Republican president and a Democratic vice president, or vice versa, or somebody from the Whig Party. Now when we vote, the candidates for president and vice president belong to the same party. So in November, we'll vote for a Republican president and vice president or a Democratic president and vice president. Amendment number 13 was very important in our history because Amendment number 13 was the amendment that abolished slavery. Now understand that even though the amendment abolished slavery, slavery did not end right away. It's not like everybody gave up their slaves. Imagine what would have happened economically. Slaves that were being taken care of by masters now have no place to live. They have no way to get food. They have no source of income. It was a gradual thing. And even when President Lincoln gave his Emancipation Proclamation, it only freed the slaves in the South. Some people don't think of or remember that the North had slaves, but the Northern slaves were generally treated better than the Southern slaves. They were almost treated like house servants, but they were slaves nonetheless. Amendment number 14 deals with citizenship and about being a natural-born citizen or a naturalized citizen. A naturalized citizen is someone that comes into the country that was not born here and wants to seek legal citizen status. And it also protected the rights of freed slaves. Amendment number 15 states that the right to vote cannot be denied based on race, color, or previous servitude. In other words, if you had been a slave and are free now, you would have the right to vote. Amendment number 16 is going to be very, very important to a lot of you in the near future because Amendment number 16 instituted a personal income tax. So when you get your job at Chick-fil-A or McDonald's or Pizza Hut or wherever you get your job and you get your check, Uncle Sam is getting his part first. Okay, that's income tax. And at the end of the year, you'll get a form from your employer, and probably because you're single, you'll get most, if not all, of your income tax back from the federal government and from the state. Now, not all states have a state income tax, but North Carolina does. And so you should get most, if not all of that back. But Uncle Sam will get his. Sometimes it's as much as 30 to 35% of your paycheck. All right, we're on the home stretch. Amendment number 17 established that there would be 2 senators per state for representation in the Senate. Amendment number 18 was important in our history because Amendment number 18 is the amendment that started prohibition. It made it illegal to manufacture, sell, and transport intoxicating beverages anywhere, especially across state lines. We in North Carolina know that this was the beginnings of what we know as NASCAR, stock car racing. During the time of Prohibition, there was an act. Get back to your seats. There was an act that was passed called the Volstead Act, and it was intended to enforce the amendment. But we know that doesn't happen because there were moonshiners in them there hills. Amendment number 19 granted suffrage to women, the right to vote. Wyoming was the first state to grant women the right to vote. Can you tell me what country was the first country to grant women the right to vote? That'd be interesting for you to find out. Amendment number 20 is an amendment that's called the lame duck amendment. This applies to the president. When a president is getting ready to leave office, the 20th Amendment prevents the president from passing stupid legislation. It establishes an official time for Congress to meet, and it established for a procedure for choosing a president if the president that is in office dies before his term begins. Amendment number 21, important amendment, because Amendment number 21 repealed prohibition. In other words, the government realized that if we made it while we were making it illegal to sell alcohol, we weren't making any money. And we weren't making any money before then. So what the 21st Amendment did was made it legal to sell alcohol, but now the federal government is going to tax it. That's why we have ABC stores. Those are government-run liquor stores. Hey, right now they're still open. I guess they're considered essential. Think about it. Amendment number 22 is the amendment that limits a president to 2 terms. Franklin Delano Roosevelt served 4 consecutive terms, 16 years. They realized that probably wasn't good for the country or for the presidency. So they limit the president to 2 terms, a maximum of 10 years, if he or she takes over the last part of, if the vice president takes over the last years of a president's term because of illness or death or impeachment. But even if it happens in the first year and he serves the remaining 3 years, he cannot serve 2 terms of his own. He can only serve 1, because again, that would put him at 11 if he served 2 terms. So he can only serve 3 years plus 4, which makes 7. Amendment number 23. Amendment number 23 gave Washington, D.C., the nation's capital, the right to vote in presidential elections. And it gave them 2 electors in what is known as the Electoral College. Okay? 2 electors in the Electoral College. Amendment number 24. This is the amendment that made it illegal to require a payment to vote. No more poll tax. Because when the poll tax was instituted, it was designed to keep certain people from voting, like blacks, like women. And so the poll tax was repealed, and now you don't have to pay to vote. Voting is a right and it's a privilege, and you can do it without paying. Amendment number 25. This amendment deals with presidential succession. If the president resigns or otherwise is unable to fulfill his office, it gives the order of succession. So if something happens to the president, then the vice president takes over. Something happens to the vice president, then it's the Speaker of the House. If something happens to the Speaker of the House, there's a succession. It will go all the way down through the cabinet positions, starting with the State Department. I'm here to tell you, the only way that would happen is if there was a zombie apocalypse. That's the only way. Okay? They don't let the president and the vice president generally travel together just in case something happens to one. It doesn't happen to both of them. Amendment number 26, and we're almost finished. Amendment number 26 granted the right to vote to citizens 18 years of age or older. So it changed the voting age from 21 to 18. And then amendment number 27, the last one that we've passed, the amendment number 27 prevents Congress from raising salaries and them becoming effective immediately. Okay, the House of Representatives has to pass all money bills, including salaries. So when representatives come into the House of Representatives, they can't say, you know what, we deserve a pay raise. Well, they can pass a pay raise, but it doesn't go into effect until the next election term. So they may not ever see their money. Well, those are our amendments. First 10 are the Bill of Rights. Last 17 were added after the Constitution was ratified. The last one, Amendment 27, was passed in 1992. So you will have a series of questions to answer based on this video. So you can watch the video and go back and answer them, and then submit your document tomorrow. Again, it'll be a Google form. It'll be a multiple choice. And so if it says that there's a wrong answer or you got it wrong or there are no correct answers, don't worry about it. You don't have to email me about it. Just answer them, submit the document, and I grade them individually. Don't forget your state reports, or again, due tomorrow night. Love you guys. Have a good evening. Bye.